The Wrong Way Home, Uncovering the Patterns of Cult Behavior in American Society by Arthur J. Deikman. Chapter 4. Dependence on a Leader. All groups have leaders, and the primary family group is no exception. Whether the leader is formally recognized or not, someone makes the decisions. Someone leads while the rest follow. The first leader we encounter is most likely to be a parent, usually our mother, the one who gives or withholds food, affection, praise, and security. Later, the father and or other family members may take similar dominant positions in our life. Biological survival requires that we become adept at pleasing those powerful people. So as children, we try to win their love and care to avoid their wrath and control their comings and goings as best we can. As adults, we bring to other groups the attitudes and behaviors we learn so early, directing them towards new leaders who, in the psychological sense at least, stand above us. A cult leader exploits this tendency. It is customary to think of cult leaders as powerful personalities who inspire, even hypnotize their audience. Charismatic leaders from Mahatma Gandhi to Adolf Hitler have been described this way. But a cult leader need not be that impressive. Alex Monroe was cerebral. His discourse is boring. He was intelligent but not inspiring. He developed power by distorting his followers' idealism, dividing their loyalties, using flattery, threats, and spurious logic to defeat objections and rationalize his demands. However, one particular characteristic links Alex with the other cult leaders of greater charisma. He was authoritarian. Authoritarians emphasize obedience, loyalty, and suppression of criticism. In groups they lead, hierarchies of rank are emphasized and autonomy discouraged. Sometimes such a leader takes a benign, loving, tolerant position, but allows his or her lieutenants to enforce an authoritarian regime. Authoritarian leaders, especially, draw power from dependency fantasy, from the individual's wish for an idealized parent. If we are sophisticated, we may reject, criticize, or look down on any public leader, but the wish remains, engendering seldom noticed fantasies of someone, or something, who deserves our behavior and rewards or punishes. It is not surprising that under certain conditions, skepticism may be overthrown and conversion occur. As in the case of the prominent 60s radical who one day called a meeting and dismayed his admirers by announcing that he had become a follower of an Indian guru. In our society, the tendency to look up to others while feeling small oneself is expressed in the enormous number of celebrities that clutter our minds. Statesmen, movie stars, sports figures, socialities, and the super rich are often given larger-than-life status by television and movies, by newspapers and magazines, all of which cater to this fantasy. Sports are instructive to me, personally, in demonstrating how much I have embraced those images. Having watched football mainly on television, I have been shocked to go to the stadium and see how small the actual football field is, and how mundane, ordinary, and ungodlike the players are when not projected onto a TV screen. Our predilection for inequality has even more prosaic expressions. Friends and patients alike remark that they do not feel now as they imagine their parents felt, and as they still imagine adults feel. This misperception tends to isolate the aged. One evening, waiting for a table at a restaurant, I sat in the anteroom, surrounded by gray-haired men and women, also waiting. I was struck by the sudden realization that these oldsters looked out at the world with the same youthful consciousness that I had, with that perception. The sense of separation from them that I had been feeling disappeared. I believe that ageism is not just fear of growing old, but also reveals the hidden wish to maintain a child's parental world. We can trace our susceptibility to authoritarian leaders to a family structure, but in doing so, we would not forget the authoritarian character of the family is both functional and appropriate. Within the family, parents and other elders are in fact superior in knowledge, experience, and strength to the children, who depend on them for protection and satisfaction of needs. That parents command and children obey is realistic because of the large discrepancy in their respective capacities. In a healthy family, as children mature and become more responsible and capable, the hierarchical, authoritarian structure moderates and becomes more democratic. Children are given appropriate responsibility and choice, which acts to reward competence and stimulate further growth. Eventually, the child's relationship to the parent reaches eye level psychologically as well as physically. This eye level perspective is the hallmark of the mature adult. Such a perspective does not imply denial of another's superior ability and knowledge. Rather, feelings of appreciation and respect replace fear, awe, and dependency. Just as the mature parent welcomes the child's ascent to equality and supports his or her maturation, the mature leader can and should exercise a similar function, according subordinates increasing responsibility, choice, and authority as they become capable. If this does not take place, subordinates remain in the position of children while the leader plays out the role of a omnipotent parent. Thus, the key issue is not the strength of the leader, but the development or suppression of autonomy. From this point of view, a hierarchical structure is not inherently bad. It can contribute to learning and is necessary when real differences in capacity exist. Furthermore, groups usually require a hierarchy for efficient performance of tasks, but a truly authoritarian leader is repressive and regressive. The structure of cults is basically authoritarian. Obedience and hierarchical power tend to take precedence over truth and conscience when they conflict, which they often do. Unfortunately, certain psychological benefits can make authoritarian groups very attractive. They provide the opportunity to feel protected and cared for. As noted earlier, the wish for parents does not disappear, but just goes underground when we become adults. Mainstream politics provides many examples. Often, the key to a politician's popularity is the capacity to present the image of a strong, good parent, to convey an optimistic, sincere self-confidence, to communicate belief in a golden future. Apparent self-confidence and freedom from doubt are characteristics of all successful cult leaders, because these postures resonate so strongly with the universal fantasy of a powerful, benign father or mother, who will remove all difficulties and reassure the frightened child. As was widely remarked during Ronald Reagan's presidency, the capacity to evoke this image provides a leader with a Teflon coating. Unpleasant, discordant facts about the leader's actions do not stick, are not held against him or her, but are pushed aside to preserve the good feelings he or she can arouse. As adults, most of us leave the conduct of public affairs to others whom we prefer to believe are superior in some way, because to do so is less anxiety-producing. The reality may be quite different. A poignant comment on this situation comes from the enterprising journalist Craig Carpel, who gained access to the 1980 Bilderberg meeting, held at Aachen, Germany. This exclusive, little-publicized summit conference of the West's power elite gathers every year to deal with whatever urgent problems face the United States and Western Europe. As Carpel points out, if the world were secretly run by someone or something, it would be the Bilderberg Group. This particular meeting included David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, McGeorge Bundy, Helmut Kohl, Helmut Schmidt, Lord Home, and a host of others comprising 100 influential leaders in the fields of government, banking, publication, and industry from various countries of the Western Alliance. The 1980 meeting took place at the beginning of a deep rift in the European-American relations, occasioned by Jimmy Carter's request for sanctions against Iran and retaliation against the Soviet Union for the invasion of Afghanistan. There was also the matter of the 16,000 Warsaw-packed tanks poised at the border of West Germany. The agenda for the meeting was entitled America and Europe, Past, Present, and Future. Expecting that the men who ran things would plan a stealthy strategy of manipulation and control, dictating the future, Karpel was disappointed. One might imagine that the goal of the Bilderberg must secretly be to attempt to shape future events and seek to profit from them. But in practice, the purpose of the meeting is to assess what has already happened and to figure out how best to respond to it, with a view to hanging on to past gains. Karpel concluded that the participants were not leaders, but managers devoted to stability and self-preservation. He concluded, "It is not inherently sinister to convene an assembly of wise men, led by those whom the wise believe to be the wisest. But one feels a certain queasiness when, like Dorothy's little dog, Toto, one pulls aside the curtain and discovers that the wizards haven't the slightest idea what to do. To insinuate oneself into such company, and to return then to the realm of the roller disco and headphone radios, is like slipping up a spiral stairway of a transoceanic 747 and into the cockpit only to discover that there is no one there. The night is dark. The howling storm lies ahead. You descend to the main cabin. The dinner service has been concluded. A number of passengers are noisily airing petty complaints. The lights dim. The movie is about to begin. And so the secret, hideous, grisly secret of Bilderberg is revealed. There's nobody at the controls, folks. We're flying blind. Let's hope there's foam on the runway. Friends and neighbors, we're coming in on a wing and a prayer." The driver's seat is empty. The parents have gone. But who wants to know? Looking up to a leader may be the result of a need to maintain a fantasy of the leader's superiority. Ronald Reagan was particularly attuned to the fantasy's attractiveness to the public. James Barber, professor of political science at Duke University, commented in the New York Times, "President Reagan's indifference to reality is hardly news. His criterion of validity is drama, not empiricism. As David Stockman, director of the Office of Management and Budget, once summed up the White House system. Every time one fantasy doesn't work, they try another one." Mr. Reagan told by a reporter that one of his favorite endlessly repeated anecdotes, how a black hero at Pearl Harbor ended segregation in the armed forces, was total fiction. Replied, "I remember the scene. It was very powerful. What matters to him is the grace and theatrical force of a performance. As a lifelong practitioner of illusion, he is in no way embarrassed by its victory over the facts." As Barber goes on to note, the contradictions ignored by the public are striking indeed. Advocating law and order at home, Reagan violated international law and order by mining Nicaragua's waters. He blithely hailed dictators as friends of democracy, and compared the Nicaraguan Contras to the founding fathers of the United States. He secretly sold arms to a terrorist nation and lied about it when the story first broke. In the Baby Jane Doe case, the Reagan administration tried to force hospitals to care for hopelessly defective infants while cutting the federal funds hospitals would need to provide such special services. Similarly, Reagan opposed abortion and at the same time endeavored to slash the budgets of agencies that would provide care for unwanted infants. It didn't seem to matter. People regarded President Reagan as a nice guy, warm-hearted, sincere. He survived the Iran-Contra debacle. While Reagan supporters ignored many of these contradictions to preserve the fantasy, his opponents erred in making Reagan a bad father, assigning him an evil capacity and intent. They often didn't consider that in believing his own fictions willfully, willfully ignoring facts, rationalizing, accepting the reassurances of friends who surrounded him, and preferring agreeable fantasies to disagreeable facts, Reagan behaved much like the rest of us. He didn't fool the public, he was the public, and other popular presidents before him, as other popular presidents before him have been. Those who hated him and those who loved him saw Reagan magnified, larger than himself, and resisted an eye-level view. Although Reagan has provided a particularly startling case of wishes dominating facts, the same process takes place in America with every president, and woe to him who falls from grace. It is interesting that the principal charge against Jimmy Carter was that he failed to provide leadership, yet he led brilliantly at Camp David. However, Carter did not appear decisive, confident, protective, optimistic. He was not, as one woman put it about Ronald Reagan, the father I always wanted. Jimmy Carter proved ordinary, like us, and I believe this was the major reason why voters felt he had to be replaced. A leader's role is more complex than it might appear. As powerful as he or she might seem, a leader is also the captive of the group, and may not fail the group's expectation or waver on the pedestal. If a leader does, the group may annihilate him. And so this eminence initially sought by the leader can become a prison. The tyrant is tyrannized. Leader and follower alike, to some degree, enact a dependency fantasy that requires an all-powerful parent who protects and rewards, and a group of children who have no responsibilities other than obedience. The leader, as much as the group members, wishes to believe that an omnipotent, perfect parent is possible, and when a person assumes the mantle, he or she participates in the fantasy as faithfully as does the follower. Yet it is still a fantasy. Margaret Rioche comments that, "We do indeed long for a shepherd who will guide us into the green and safe pastures. The trouble with this simile, when applied to human beings, is that the shepherd is another sheep. He may be dressed up in a long coat and accompanied by a tall staff with a crook on the end of it, by other formidable symbols of high office, but underneath the cloak is one of the sheep, and not, alas, a member of a more intelligent and more far-seeing species. But the wish, and sometimes the need, for a leader is so strong that it is almost always possible for one of the sheep to play the role of the shepherd of the flock." Most people realize the danger a leader can pose. They have read of Jonestown, and they know of the crimes of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Tsung, Pol Pot, the precariousness and danger of the leader role for the leader is not so well known, although it is illustrated by the face of many who have headed New Age religious and utopian groups. For Alex Monroe, the leader of the Life Force movement, the need to maintain the status of a superior, omnipotent being was a key factor. Carried away by grandiose wishes, Alex expanded his activities, publishing an ambitious magazine and establishing multiple training centers. At the same time, he was unwilling to share his power. He had to supervise and decide everything. Alex could not manage all of these tasks, and he dealt with his failure by projecting blame on everyone. As a consequence, his paranoid thinking accelerated. It should be noted that his followers supported this process because they chose to overlook the contradictions between the mystical teachings he espoused and the dishonest, cruel behavior he and they engaged in. For his followers, to recognize what was actually taking place would have been to cease to believe in Alex as a powerful, wise parent and themselves as disciples, children, pursuing an ennobling special path. Neither Alex nor the group wished to give up the fantasy. A study of history reveals numerous leaders overreaching themselves, becoming inflated with an omnipotent dream they share with their followers. Perhaps because of the behavior of their emperors, the ancient Romans had an awareness of the problem of grandiosity. as a victorious general on his day of triumph rode past the cheering crowds, leading a long procession of soldiers, captured slaves and booty, a man would stand behind him in the chariot, continually whispering, "Remember, you are immortal." It is hard for a leader to remember that he or she is mortal. When followers wish for a divinity, when they attribute to the leader the qualities of a super-parent, in addition, the leader finds that he or she can wield enormous influence over group members through the gratification he or she can provide or withhold. That gratification is seen as the most intense form, in its most intense form as bliss, which in this context can be interpreted as the joy that springs up when an adult becomes a child once again. How wonderful to relinquish all choice and decision, to be secure in the belief that the super-parent will take care of everything, when, at the same time, this regression is said to be for the good of the human race, to help bring about salvation of the world. Then the bliss is complete, because it seems noble as well. Of course, it takes some doing to maintain the fantasy of riding in the back seat of the car. Frequently, I find that a patient has refused to exercise his or her full strength, fearing the loss of the feeling of protection, of being watched over by a parental force, even a cruel one. That stands between him or her and an imagined chaos. This tendency is widespread. When a leader's actions conflict with the group's principles, standards, or values, followers may twist words and meanings to reduce cognitive dissonance and maintain the fantasy. According to published accounts, one well-known Eastern guru with a propensity for drunkenness became angered at a visiting couple who had withdrawn from a wild party, held at a retreat, and secluded themselves in their room, refusing his commands to appear. He ordered his guards to bring them by force, which they did, breaking down the door and engaging the man in a fight during which he wielded a broken glass as a weapon, wounding one of the guards. The couple was finally brought to stand before the guru, who ordered that they be stripped naked. The woman and man were thrown to the floor and their clothes torn off. The woman called for help, but only one onlooker came to their defense, and he was struck. The nude couple were then brought to stand before the guru. Shortly thereafter, everyone at the party stripped. The guru's actions were later justified by a follower. Vajrayana's teachings are ruthless. Compassion takes many forms. Calling the drunken guru's behavior compassion is an example of what George Orwell in 1984 called doublespeak, manipulating the abstractions of language to suggest a meaning and value opposite to the real situation. This is one-way discrepancies between group fantasies and actual behavior can be painted over. The power of the dependency fantasy is uncovered in the case cited above by the fact that the abused couple chose to stay on for the conclusion of the retreat. The man explained, We'd come to study the whole course. We'd taken it, as he, the guru, knew. Seriously, we wanted to finish what we'd begun and not be scared off. The last lap, about to begin, was the famous tantric teachings. In such extreme cases, the individual's perception has to be narrowed and critical thinking suppressed. Groups have effective means of doing this. As in Clara Robinson's case, if group members voiced objections or criticism, he or she may be attacked as ignorant, unworthy, selfish, elitist, whatever term is used to define badness. Groups, as well as leaders, may punish dissent or deviation when maintenance of the super-parent fantasy requires that no imperfections be revealed, lest the whole structure be put in jeopardy. Seldom does anyone stand behind the leader to whisper, "Remember, you are mortal." In a cult, the leader is accepted as having special powers or semi-divine status, which places him or her outside the behavior norms of the ordinary person. As we have seen, similar exemptions from the rules and the accompanying claim to infallibility enables many a leader to perform unethical acts that would otherwise not be countenanced. In ordinary life, traces of this dynamic can be seen, although the situation is seldom as stark as in extreme cults. When the facts become impossible to ignore, the leader is dethroned. But all too often, the dependency fantasy continues. A new parent is found. We find examples of the abuses of the role of leader in recent political history. Richard Nixon's handling of the Watergate break-in suggests that being president had eroded his judgment, encouraged grandiosity, and blinded him with the righteousness which arises easily in powerful leaders when they are criticized and challenged. For absolute rulers, the danger is even worse. Witness the career of Idi Amin, who ended up rivaling Caligula in the bloody, paranoid expressions of his vanity and fear. We have seen how the idealism of Hugh and Clara was used as a lever to break their ties with family members and to justify unethical, harmful actions. Idealism can be exploited as a source of the leader's power. He or she need only inspire and mobilize the readiness for self-sacrifice which exists within many people. In the business world, the importance of generating fervor was noted by Thomas Peter and Robert Waterman Jr. in their studies of excellent companies. They found that transforming leadership played a crucial role in the history of outstanding corporations. Charismatic leaders stirred the emotions of their employees so as to instill a sense of elevated purpose, fulfilling the crucial human need for meaning and purpose. Sometimes the meaning may not seem very profound to an outside observer. Charles Edward Wilson, president of General Electric from 1940 to 1950, created a strong impression on Reginald Jones, who himself later became president of the company. I still remember Charlie Wilson. He was the very epitome of inspirational leader. He told us in the town hall how Westinghouse planned to surpass us in sales and earnings. They should live so long, he roared. Their grandchildren should live so long. And he got us out behind the marching band, and they led us to the flagpole playing Onward Christian Soldiers. At that moment, I would have followed him anywhere on earth, and beyond if necessary. Even if the summons is for political or economic goals rather than religious ones, the energies mobilized will be the same, and the final result is declared to be for the greater good, creating paradise on earth, saving the world. What matters is that people's deepest desires for the good will be mobilized. That is why the most effective leaders inspire rather than overpower. This was the conclusion of a study of audience reactions to a charismatic leader. They were apparently strengthened and uplifted by the experience. They felt more powerful rather than less powerful or submissive. This suggests that the traditional way of explaining the influence of a leader on his followers has not been entirely correct. He does not force them to submit and follow him by sheer overwhelming magic of his personality and persuasive powers. He is influential by strengthening and inspiriting his audience. Anyone who watched films of Hitler's speeches and the crowd's reactions would agree. Hitler, transformed by his own fantasies, brought his audience's fantasies and wishes to life, made them seem possible. He whipped his listeners into intoxicating heights of emotion, restoring significance to their lives, asking for sacrifices. Most of us need to feel that our lives have meaning and purpose, that we are special and are living in a way that is consonant with our ideals. And it is not only the young that long to live idealistically. Older people who have led practical lives and have accepted the necessity of compromising their ideas may respond with great commitment if offered the opportunity to sacrifice for a good cause. This appeal to the perception of a larger reality, to unsatisfied idealism, and the wish for meaning can be very powerful, and it can be put to good or bad use. Authoritarian leadership tends to become established in large corporations where power has become overtly centralized. Harold Janine, who ran ITT like a potentate, knows whereof he speaks. The authority vested in the chief executive of a large company is so great, so complete, and demands made upon his time are so consuming, that most chief executives slip into authoritarian roles without realizing that the process is going on. John DeLorean, former General Motors executive, describes the increase in authoritarianism at General Motors in the years following the departure of Alfred Sloan, who had been chairman of the board. I watched GM's operations slowly become centralized. The divisions gradually were stripped of their decision-making power. The guiding corporate precept of centralized policy-making and decentralized decision-making was totally and purposefully ignored. There was no system of checks and balances. The divisions reported to the 14th floor, but the 14th floor reported only to itself. The authoritarian attitude results in emphasis on punishment and the manifestation of power by saying no. The veto is safer and more impressive than granting permission. Although innovation and creativity may be given lip service, even insignificant mistakes are usually punished despite their being the inevitable price of developing a new approach or new product. Peters and Waterman, in reviewing the problem, came to the conclusion that this behavior reflects the same superior-inferior perspective that Erich Fromm emphasized in his study of authoritarian political behavior. Central to the whole notion is the superior-subordinate relationship, the idea of manager as boss, and the corollary that orders will be issued and followed. The threat of punishment is the principal implied power that underlies it all. The hierarchical emphasis is underlined by corporate class distinctions, the executive washroom, the special dining room for upper management, superior furnishings, and more space are all indicators of a higher position. Indeed, the top executives usually will be found on the highest floor. This institutionalization of the upward gaze is accepted almost everywhere and seldom questioned by any more than is the assumption of parents having the largest bedroom in the home, a separate bathroom, and other special prerogatives. Even when the chief executive officer wishes to make the organization less authoritarian, the task is not easy. Cornell Meyer, former CEO for Kaiser Aluminum, recalls a lesson he learned when his corporation began to decentralize decision-making. As we started giving more authority to our operating divisions, an interesting thing happened. All of the managers working for me felt that they should have a lot more authority in their decision-making, capital spreading, personnel moves, what have you. That wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise was that nearly all of them felt that the people working for them shouldn't have more authority. They wanted a lot more authority, but didn't want to give that authority away. Nor did they wish to give up symbols of elevated status they had acquired as part of the superior-inferior authoritarian world. The chief executive officer of a large corporation does not usually claim divine attributes. However, the CEO's power to hire, fire, reward, and punish is very great in the hands of an authoritarian personality. This power can result in suppression of critical thinking within the corporation and mindless conformity, and fawning support for whatever the CEO believes and decides to do. Sometimes this behavior extends to a slavish copying of the style of dress and behavior of the boss. In his book, The Fanciest Dive, Christopher Byron gives an amusing description of the antics that took place at Time Inc. when a new boss, Richard Monroe, entered the scene. No sooner did word spread that the company's new president ate breakfast early most mornings at the Dorset Hotel on West 54th Street than numerous subordinates began doing the same. It was there, one hot September morning in 1982, that Monroe, having breakfast, stood up and removed his suit jacket to be more comfortable. All around the room, Time Inc., executives promptly rose and did the same, and Monroe took to carrying a red bandana with a corner flapping loosely from his hip pocket. The corridors of the big house were soon ablaze with red bandanas waving jauntily from the hip pockets of hopeful executives. Like similar leaders everywhere, authoritarian executives can easily end up valuing the conformity, loyalty, obedience, and subservience of subordinates more than their actual performance. A boss wants to trust his or her subordinates, to count on their loyalty, to know that they fit in and will not cause trouble. Subordinates who conform to the boss's own style of dress and behavior invoke in him a sense of support and comfort. The boss feels he knows where his subordinates stand and can rely on them to perform as he would in unsupervised situations. In turn, the employees know that salaries, promotion, and assignments within the company lie in the hands of their boss, when obedience, loyalty, and conformity matter more than performance. Cult-like behavior takes place all along the hierarchy. Secrecy about salaries, competition for the boss's favor, and fear of being left behind can create an atmosphere reminiscent of that which occurred in Life Force, one manager described. The big fear complex that operates within this GPI because there are so many people who are, or will, or might be your boss, or might be, or do have influence on you one way or the other. The fear syndrome keeps you from speaking up, and it works in the compensation area as well. While you may know your salary, obviously more money is at the whimsical beck and call of your boss, and a few other people perhaps. What is a god if not a supreme authority? In religions the world over, the devout acknowledge their god's divine wisdom, mercy, and awesome power. They pray for protection, forgiveness, and benefits. Even in Buddhism, whose founder declared that notions of gods and heavens were illusions, most believers bow to the Buddha idol with all the expectations found in theistic religions. Few people take seriously the injunctions of mystics against seeking to understand the ultimate via familiar images. Typical of such an injunction is the statement of St. John of the Cross. That inward wisdom is so simple, so general, and so spiritual that it has not entered into the understanding enwrapped or clad in any form or image subject to sense. It follows that sense and imagination, as it has not entered through them, nor has taken their form and color, can account for it or imagine so as to say anything concerning it, although the soul be clearly aware that it is experiencing and partaking of that rare and delectable wisdom. St. John maintained that knowledge of God cannot be expressed in terms of this world, cannot be articulated by using the images and concepts of everyday life. Family, mother, father, children, reward, punishment, etc. Similar statements about the unknowability of the Godhead have been made by mystics of widely differing cultures throughout history. They are very consistent, nevertheless formal religions tend to use the familiar relationship of parent and child as the model for human beings' relationship to the divine. This model inevitably creates cult dynamics in religious organizations. In part, the problem arises because the founding mystics of the theistic religions, in their attempts to communicate the ineffable, made use of the concept of God the Father, the Supreme Parent, although only as a metaphor. However, their listeners took the meaning literally. Thus, religions ends up teaching, be good, obey God's wishes, and you will be rewarded. Enter heaven or nirvana. If you are bad, but disobey God, you will be punished with hell or reincarnation. The dependency wish usually requires tangible authority figures, and they are seldom in short supply. Muhammad abolished the priesthood, but equivalent ecclesiastical officials, the mullahs, arose after his death, and in some areas, such as Iran, now a theocracy, the chief mullah rules with more authority than the present-day pope. Another example is provided by Hinduism. While the Upanishads preach the oneness of all being, the Brahmin priests whose function it is to transmit Hindu teachings have maintained the caste system and their superior status within it. It took all the powers of Gandhi to begin to crack the caste barriers, enclosing the untouchables of India. Theistic religions such as Christianity, Judaism, or Islam are intrinsically authoritarian. Expressing the belief in God as supreme being who transcends the material world is infinitely superior to human beings and to whom we owe obedience. God's absolute superiority in power, goodness, and knowledge may be used by religious leaders to justify their own authority and to legitimize their demands for submission. For the most part, theistic religions teach that compliance with God's will, coupled with an appropriately humble attitude, will be rewarded by protection and help for the supplicant. That pride, putting oneself at eye level with God, is a sin, and submission is a virtue. The greater the emphasis on the supreme God, the superparent, versus the inferior follower, the child, the more the stage is set for cult behavior in any religion, orthodox or not. Thus, in any authoritarian system, the basic perspective of most religious groups is one of superior-inferior relationships, as obedience is the prime virtue in all authoritarian systems. So obedience to God's commandments is a prime virtue in theistic religions. This is espoused most rigidly by fundamentalists, those who believe in the literal inherent truth of the Bible, the Quran, or any other religious text. Reverend Jerry Falwell puts the matter most unequivocally. We must be obedient to the Word of God. Obedient. Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. That's all there is to it. Find out what God is saying to you and obey him. Obey the Lord. Obedience. Of course, the critical issue is not obedience per se, but why we are obedient and to what or to whom. Blind obedience leads to totalitarianism. Refusal to obey anything leads to chaos. Free will, as distinguished from impulsivity, combines obedience with choice. It is the experience of being the author of the law you obey. Being the author means to choose the values expressed in the law, to freely assent to them based on one's judgment, experience, and sense of the good. The best religious leaders teach that a truly spiritual choice is an expression of oneself and not an expression of fear, of punishment, or greed, for reward, or vanity, or being the one of the chosen few. A story from the Suffolk tradition, here told by Idris Shah, addressed the issue. 3 reasons. There was once a powerful conqueror who had become emperor of a vast territory peopled by representatives of several beliefs. His counselors said, "Great king, a deputation of thinkers and priests from each persuasion is awaiting audience. Each hopes to convert you to the way of thinking of his school. We are in a quandary, because we cannot advise you to accept the ideology of any one part, since it would alienate the goodwill of all the rest." The king, for his part, said, Neither is it fitting that a king should adopt beliefs for political reasons and without thought for his own higher dignity and well-being. The discussions continued for several hours, until a wise dervish, who had attached himself to the king's retinue many months before and had been silent ever since, stepped forward. "Majesty," he said, "I am prepared to advise a course in which interests of all parties will be safeguarded. The applicants will be abashed. The couriers will be relieved of their anxiety to find a solution. The king will be able to retain his reputation for wisdom, and nobody will be able to say that he holds sway over the king's thoughts." The dervish whispered the formula into the royal ear, and the king called the deputation to enter the throne room. Receiving the clerics and thinkers with all courtesy, the king said to them, "I shall hear first all of the arguments of those among you who do not say, 'Believe or you are in peril,' or 'Believe because it will give you happiness,' or 'Adopt my beliefs because you are a great king.'" The applicants dispersed in confusion. Although a person may be drawn to a religion through the wish to find meaning and purpose, to serve God and humanity, religious organizations are all too often fail to avoid stimulating fear, greed, or flattery in recruiting members. Consequently, the obedience commanded tends to evoke the attitude of the child towards its parent. Obedience is certainly necessary for certain kinds of learning and development and has definite functions in religious instruction, but great religious teachers agree that the highest obedience is to the religion's essence. Obedience to the literal scriptures, to the form rather than the essence, opens the door to cult processes. The problem of form taking precedence over the contents is one that plagues all religions and is defined as idolatry. Anything can be idolized, including rituals and rules, and the resulting behavior may contradict the values that the religion espouses. A Benedictine prioress reflected on the reversal of priorities that marked the religious life during her early years with the order. Formalism and legalism had completely replaced either spiritual direction or blessing. Everyday life got smaller. Religious life had become the celebration of the trivial, while McCarthyism raged. I was told to guard myself from spiritual distraction by not listening to the news. While Martin Luther King began black sit-ins of white lunch counters in a country that routinely lynched blacks, I believed it when they said that had nothing to do with religious life, and concentrated on darning my socks. A real sign of poverty, I was told. When a religion's texts are regarded as literally true and infallible, a likely next step is that the leader's interpretation becomes what's true and sacred. Then a member's obedience is transferred to the priest, rabbi, mullah, or minister. This is the lowest level of obedience, most likely to lead to overt cult behavior. Reverend R.G. Puckett, the Baptist evangelist who heads Americans United, warned of this development taking place in American Christian fundamentalist churches. The church is centered in the pastor. He is the authority, the ruling force. Falwell, Robertson, all the rest are personality cults, people who follow the person, the pastor, not Jesus Christ. You may say he is not telling anyone how to vote or how to live, but the very climate and mentality of the whole church says, what the pastor wants is what we do. Such preachers do not claim divinity, only that God speaks to them, inspires them, guides them. That claim may be quite enough to demand complete obedience. and to brand disagreement with their views and wishes as a sign that the defiant member is lost to salvation. Religious leaders may be as attracted to the security and certainty of certainty and surrender as are their followers. Many really believe they are commanded by God, that they have become instruments of His will, and that their pronouncements are beyond error. Others, with less exalted views of themselves, nevertheless succumb to the lure of certainty and rightness. From a priest who has faced the shortcomings of his church, we have an eloquent testimony to that attraction. I do not now live without worry or responsible concern. In fact, I have never felt so responsible since I discovered that the church cannot absorb my conscience, nor replace my mind. Life was easier when I knew where everything fit, when I could lose myself in the structure of a massive organization. There heaven and hell were governed by careful laws. There God's friendship was certain and manageable, and I was satisfied when I kept the church rules. Liz Harris, writing in The New Yorker, contrasted her own state of uncertainty with the security of the Hasidic world. I envied them their sureness, and sheer weight it gave them. I had, of course, my family and friends, my work, and the various pleasures that came my way. But spirituality, I felt as if it floated weightlessly in the universe. The Hasidism had a world without time, eternal life, in the extraordinary sense that everything they did counted. Surrender is a basic feature of spiritual life, as an acceptance of selfless goals in place of self-centeredness. It is something most recognized as inherently desirable. Yet the call to surrender can become a tool for manipulation and control when critical judgment is set aside. As we have seen earlier, Clara Robinson was exhorted to give up her concern for her child and surrender to Life Force's greater spiritual task as set forth by Alex Monroe. Her reluctance to do so was defined as selfishness. Barbara Underwood, a former Mooney, described similar coercion in the Unification Church, and total surrender is called for by fundamentalist preachers and organizations such as the Campus Crusade. Bill Bright, writing in Jesus and the Intellectual, makes it quite explicit. The secret is surrender. Commitment to Christ involves the surrender of the intellect, the emotions, and the will, the total person. There is no place in such groups for reasoned, independent judgment, no free will, no responsible choice, only literal adherence to sacred text as selected and interpreted by the church leader or organization. With surrender, the authority of the leader is maximized. The follower feels relieved of uncertainty and choice, and can then experience the bliss of someone who has returned home. Since most of the examples I have cited are from the fundamentalist and conservative wings of established religions, some readers may feel my conclusions do not apply to them because they are involved in less doctrinaire, more moderate, more sophisticated beliefs and practices. I would respond that it is a matter of degree, and that each person needs to assess the extent to which cult behavior and the dependency fantasy are operative in his or her religious life. I believe that such awareness is of particular importance because the goal of religion should be to facilitate the direct experience of the spiritual dimension. Although human beings carry within them the potential for aggressive dependency, they also contain the potential for the intuition of the spiritual. That perception, however dim, of something that transcends the reality accessible to the senses and ordinary thought. This intuition is universal and can be very powerful. Indeed, mystics claim that spiritual development consists of strengthening that inborn intuitive capacity, permitting one to know the larger reality called truth, God, original mind, Brahma, whatever name may be invoked, assuming the existence of that perceptual capacity latent in everyone. The question arises of the effect of cult-like behavior in one's capacity to experience the spiritual. Study of the mystical literature of many religions reveals all these traditions to be in agreement that to develop the ability to perceive God or truth, one must shift form from a self-centered orientation to serving the underlying reality. This service must be without concern for personal gain. Basic intentions must change. There can be no cheating on this one because motivations determine the form of consciousness. You cannot grasp the spiritual world as you can the material space, since a grasping mind is necessarily focused on discrete objects and cannot encompass a world of connectedness, of unity. It is for this reason, a functional, not a moral reason, that mystics assert that no matter what you may say or do, no matter how you may appear, if your underlying intention is self-centered, perception of truth or God is impossible. The necessary shift in motivation takes time, effort, and skillful guidance. To repent and believe is not enough. An organization that enhances selfish intentions is at cross purposes with spiritual development and is anti-spiritual. To stimulate fear of punishment, greed for reward, or vanity at being among the saved versus the damned, is to stimulate a self-centered orientation. These powerful motivations are not in the surface of spiritual development. This is why one saint declared, O Lord, if I worshipped you from fear of hell, cast me into hell. If I worship you for desire for paradise, deny me paradise. Dependence on a leader parent can be doubly destructive in the sphere of religion. Not only does it impair ordinary judgment and create a regressive pull on members and converts of religious groups, it prevents them from progressing beyond a self-centered orientation. This blocks the perception of the spiritual force that is the vital element within religions, a force that might otherwise enhance and guide their lives. I do not mean to say that a religion's members may not devote themselves to actions benefiting others. To the contrary, great charity and service have been inspired by religious beliefs and administered by religious institutions throughout the centuries. Cult behavior is largely an interior problem in which form, doctrine and authority, dominates content, the experience of the real, producing idolatry. Understanding the nature of the problem facilitates an attitude vitally different from the authoritarian. A school sister of Notre Dame comments, Although as a woman religious, I am identified with church institutions. In the final analysis, God, not any institution, is paramount. To associate with and to preserve any structure at the expense of serving God and humanity is idolatry. To follow God's call rather than an institutional call, if the two are in conflict, it is a moral imperative. I pray always for the grace and the insight to discern God's call. Certainly, if a religious group provides us with security and identity, we will not see its cult features very readily. One's own group is thought to be above such behavior. A cult is seen as something that you yourself don't belong to, but perhaps in some ways you do. It just isn't obvious when measured against Jonestown or the Life Force Institute. My own profession of psychiatry is not immune from cult behavior. To begin with, the psychotherapeutic situation itself encourages the emergence of a dependency relationship. In psychoanalysis and analytically oriented psychotherapy, the therapist reveals almost nothing, while the patient is expected to reveal all. Since the therapist is calm, reticent, and an authority, while the patient is distressed and seeking help, a parent-child feeling quickly develops. With time, the unique character of the patient's early relationship with his or her parents tends to be transferred to the therapist. In fact, Freud emphasized the importance of this transference in helping the patient and saw the intensification of the parent-child fantasy as the desired effect of psychotherapeutic situation as a desired side effect of the psychotherapeutic situation. Nonetheless, it should be recognized that Freud intended that the patient reclaim the power he or she bestowed on the therapist. He hoped that analysis of the transference would give to the patient an eye-level perspective towards the analyst, as well as toward others. I know of no other profession or institution that has established a goal of relinquishing authority and built-in comprehensive techniques for its accomplishment. Even though the return of power takes place only imperfectly, and in some cases not at all, dedication to an eye-level relationship is a direct counter to cult-like behavior and offers hope for a more mature society. Regrettably, the ideal may be preached but not always practiced. Psychotherapists may exploit their position in the same fashion as do all cult leaders. This can take place in several ways, from automatically interpreting a patient's criticism as neurotic, dismissing any questions as a projection or acting out of the transference, to outright sexual seduction. I remember a cartoon about psychiatry with the punchline, "This is the only business where the customer is always wrong." The patient is not always wrong in his or her perceptions of the therapist. It is crucial that the therapist is able to see in what ways the patient is correct, acknowledge and support the patient's perception, and go on to investigate what the therapist's error or limitations means to the patient. Competent therapists do this, but only an ideal therapist is completely free from defensiveness and denial. Therapists, like other leaders, are often flattered and idealized by their patients, who wish them to be omnipotent, omniscient, surrogate parents. Resisting this seduction is particularly hard for a psychotherapist because he or she is likely to have entered the profession with the same very fantasy of being an ideal parent, one who saves grateful patients. In this context, the patient may represent the therapist as a child or the therapist's parent, whoever needs saving. Having become a therapist, one may fall in with the patient's wish when it supports the savior fantasy. While the patient is not officially a follower, nor is the therapist a cult leader, the dependency needs of the former and the omnipotent fantasies of the latter can create cult-like behavior. Actual cults may develop in therapeutic situations. Although this is rare, there have been instances of therapists who develop relationships with their patients in which they occupy the roles of colleagues, teachers, lovers, friends, and employers simultaneously. Such a violation of professional ethics and psychiatric principles is not necessarily due to substandard psychiatric training. In one study of 5 such therapeutic cults, 2 of the leaders were psychoanalysts, members of a prestigious American Psychoanalytic Association. Yet these therapeutic cults functioned almost like religious cults. Although actual cult formation by psychiatrists is unusual, there are 2 areas where covert cult-like behavior is significant. In the 1950s and 1960s, Psychoanalysis was in its heyday of acceptance and power. The heads of departments of psychiatry in medical schools were usually psychoanalysts. It was assumed that the best psychiatry residents would become psychoanalysts. The second best would have to settle for something inferior. Indeed, as a psychiatric resident, I was told that only psychoanalysts offered a patient real change, real treatment. Psychotherapy was a patch-up job. How powerfully such a consensus prevailed and affected judgment is hard to convey, even though there were abundant cases of unresolved neurotic problems among former analysts and among the training analysts themselves. And although one heard anecdotes of psychotherapy results that rivaled the best of psychoanalysts, the assumption pervades much of the psychoanalytic literature today, and I think it has had a debilitating effect on the psychoanalytic thinking. Psychoanalytic institutes, where psychoanalysis is taught, are not cults, but cult behavior does take place in them. Cult features have been so prominent that noted analysts have remarked on the similarity between psychoanalytic institutes and religious organizations. Otto Kernberg, training analyst at the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, points to features of psychoanalytic education that justifies designation as a system of religious beliefs. The religious assertion of faith in the existence of the deity and the essentially irrational nature of such a faith are not unlike the sense of conviction about the truth of psychoanalytic theory, particularly about the unconscious. This sense of conviction is usually traced to an emotional experience connected with the discovery of the unconscious in oneself and the experience of psychological change following this discovery. In both instances, a highly subjective personal experience, an emotional encounter with the unknown rather than rational analysis, constitutes the anchoring pillar of the educational program. This could be a description of Hugh and Clara Robinson's conversion to faith in the life force psychology, or the experience of converts to numerous new religions of the 60s and 70s. Kernberg goes on to point out further similarities. In addition, this deeply transforming emotional experience is carried out in the context of an intense relation to another person, idealized and experienced as a spiritual guide, complemented by other mentors who focus on the limitations, shortcomings, mistakes, and inadequacies of the student's performance, while sustaining the assumption that they are working at a higher level, which the student must reach through ongoing self-exploration, as well as learning about the formulations of the masters. In the end, the original master of the school, Freud. The analogy to reason is seconded by Jacob Arlo, a past president of the American Psychoanalytic Association, who pointed out that the psychoanalytic education is unique among learned disciplines in that most of its basic texts are 50 years old. He observes that this can't be wholly explained as the debt of psychoanalysis. To Freud because of the characteristic clinging to the past that marks the educational emphasis. Freud's earlier writings received greater attention than either his latter, superseding writings, or the contributions of recent analysis. Arlo further notes that psychoanalytic training is experienced as a profound initiation rite. During the long course of tests which initiates undergo personal analysis, admission to courses, first case, second case, etc., graduation, the training analysts serve the double function characteristic of all initiators. Some intimidate the candidates, others act as sponsors and guides. Anxiety propels the candidate into affecting an identification with the aggressor. The initiate remodels himself after the image the community holds up as the ideal. The situation of the candidates is not unlike that of members of Life Force who were dependent on the good opinion of the leader, therapist, Alex, for their graduation to the inner circle of the center. Depending on the candidate, the effects could be similar in kind. In 1961, John F. Kennedy made the disastrous decision to go ahead with a covert invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles. The operation, referred to afterwards as the Bay of Pigs, it was a spectacular failure. About a year later, when it was discovered that Russian nuclear missiles were being installed in Cuba, Kennedy was successful in bringing about their withdrawal, an operation usually called the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis were historic events whose decision-making processes are exceptionally well documented. I will use them to illustrate both cult behavior and the possibility of more realistic behavior at the government level. Irving Janis, a psychologist who studied the effect of group process on presidential advisory groups, pointed to the important role of shared illusions in disasters such as the attempted invasion of Cuba. One was the illusion of invulnerability. People believe that if their leader and everyone else thinks a proposal will succeed, then it will, even if it is risky and requires luck. An air of omniscience and invulnerability is fostered by political leaders as well, in part because the public demands leaders who are forceful and confident. Unwavering optimism is preferred to doubts and uncertainty. The fantasy of invulnerability is identical in cults, where it may lead to disaster. For example, an epical celebration, brainchild, of a young Indian guru was held some years ago in Houston, Texas. With the guru's approval, his followers hired the Astrodome, expecting it to fill it with thousands of people who would be drawn to hear his message. Confidence was unbound. No doubts were heard, as the guru was presumed infallible. Publicity and preparations were extensive and lavish. Media coverage nationwide. The celestial appearance of the comet Kahutek was interpreted as a cosmic herald of the grand event. What actually took place was a grand fiasco. Although droves of the guru's followers arrived at the stadium, very few others availed themselves of this opportunity to adulate him and share in the momentous event. The monetary and public relation losses were staggering. The organization went into decline. From blissful blind optimism of this guru and his followers to the arrogant overconfidence of the top U.S. government officials in the Bay of Pigs advisory group was not such a large step. Robert Kennedy recalled, "It seemed that, with John Kennedy leading us, and with all the talent he had assembled, nothing could stop us." Arthur Schlesinger felt the same. One further factor no doubt influenced him, John F. Kennedy. The enormous confidence in his own luck. Everything had broken right for him since 1956. He had won the nomination and the election against all odds in the book. Everyone around him thought he had the Midas touch and could not lose. Despite himself, even this dispassionate and skeptical man may have been affected by the soaring euphoria of the new day. One cannot understand the phenomenon of authoritarian behavior in democratic presidents without appreciating the attraction for both leaders and followers of a superior-inferior parent-child perspective. I have a vivid memory of an incident that occurred during a Tavistock Group Relations Conference. Participants were divided into several large groups, and each group was asked to relate the other groups by appointing suitably empowered representatives. No group leaders were designated, no goals or structure provided. In the absence of authority and direction, anxiety built up rapidly. Everyone talked at once. I tried to reduce the chaos by establishing leadership. "Make me a leader," I pleaded. The group would not appoint any one person to that power position. The disorganization and tension increased. Finally, I stood up, shouted, "I'm taking command," and began appointing people to assume the functions of doorkeeper, ambassador, and so forth. The same people who would not voluntarily delegate authority now obeyed with alacrity. The conference conditions had intensified our primitive impulses, and we had behaved like a group of sibling children. No one willing to take the adult action of delegating power. When my discomfort drove me to take the role of dictator parent, the others readily submitted, for they were then free of responsibility. The parallel need to structure a situation in terms of a child rebelling against a bad parent was illustrated for me when I had to hospitalize an adolescent against his will. A state trooper arrived at my office to take him away. It was clear that the officer wanted to be compassionate and helpful. My patient would have none of this. He resisted, struggled, taunted, and provoked the trooper until the man became angry and finally cuffed him on the head with his open hand. Immediately, the younger man became docile and accompanied him readily. It was clear to me that my patient had succeeded in his aim of making the policeman a bad parent. Later, the teacher at the boys' school denounced this police brutality and was indignant when I replied that I thought the state trooper was the one who had been brutalized. In each of these incidents, those involved refused or were unable to go beyond the parent-child or the child-parent relationship and insisted on an authoritarian structure. I see the compliance of the first instance and the rebelliousness of the second as two aspects looking up at authority. Like most cults and formal religions, governments cite a higher principle or authority to justify their actions. This is probably what Samuel Johnson mocked when he said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel." As Alex Monroe's lies were justified as being necessary to advance the work of saving the world, other cult leaders, tyrants, and terrorists inevitably defend immoral and violent actions as serving God or truth or country or freedom. Psychologist Stanley Milgram's research demonstrated the effectiveness of this reference to a higher authority. People from all walks of life participated as subjects in his studies. An experimenter in a gray lab coat told the subjects that the purpose of the experiment was to advance science, and then instructed them to give increasing electric shocks to a learner strapped into an electric chair. Unbeknownst to the subjects, the learner was a confederate of the research and actually received no shocks at all. The subjects were told that although the shocks could be extremely painful to the learner, they caused no permanent damage. As the experiment proceeded, the learner became increasingly vocal, agitated, and desperate. He eventually screamed each time the subject shocked him. He demanded and begged to be released, expressing concern for his heart. Most subjects showed evidence of considerable stress as they were ordered to continue despite the anguished cries of pain, which they could hear from the other room. In further experiments in which the learner was in the same room with them, the subjects could also see his tortured appearance. Contrary to predictions, most subjects continued to administer the electric shocks right up to the supposed limit of 450 volts, labeled danger, severe shock. When the learner was in the same room, 40% of the subjects continued to the end of the scale, even when the subject was required to force the learner's hand down onto the shock plate and hold it there against his struggles. 30% applied the most severe shocks possible. To appreciate these results, it is important to understand the acting of the learner was very, very convincing. Follow-up studies confirmed that almost all of the subjects believed that the shocks were actually being administered and that the man was suffering severe pain. Many of the subjects showed evidence of great stress as they complied with the experimenter's instructions. What direct pressure made the subjects continue despite their own distress at what they were doing? It consisted of the following statements, said firmly but politely by the experimenter, using as many of them as he might need to overcome the subject's protests and concerns. Please continue, or please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. There were no threats, no physical coercion, no other inducements. Milgram came to the conclusion that in such situations people enter into what he terms as a gentite state, one in which they see themselves as agents for carrying out another person's wishes. This shift from autonomous functioning to submission to a hierarchy of command is considered by Milgram to be an evolutionary development that has enabled human beings to take advantage of the benefits of being in large groups. Unfortunately, may also lead one to administer suffering on others if it is justified by an authority. The human element behind the agencies and institutions is denied. Thus, when the experimenter says, "The experiment requires that you continue," the subject feels this to be an imperative that goes beyond any merely human command. He does not ask the seemingly obvious question, whose experiment? Why should the designer be served while the victim suffers? The wishes of the man, the designer of the experiment, have become part of the schema which exerts on the subject's mind a force that transcends the personal. It is easy to see how this type of justification has led to nations transgressing human values. In our own country, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, blameless American citizens were dispossessed and forcibly moved into internment camps for the duration of the war because they were of Japanese descent. In the name of national security, the fundamental values and principles of our democracy were thrust aside and great injustice done. Similarly, as a nation, and despite internal dissent, we justified our actions in Vietnam by the concept of fighting communist aggression, as we attempted to defoliate the forest with Agent Orange and napalm civilians. The American government has supported and still supports governments whose murderous savagery and sickening use of torture equals, if not surpasses, Stalin's and, with the possible exception of genocide, rivals that of the Nazis. We are likely to be told that the national interest requires our support, just as the experiment in Milgram's study assumed an impersonal, overriding authority. Even more so does the national interest, as Noam Chomsky noted in a symposium on human rights. The concept of national interest is a mystification that serves to conceal the ways in which the state policy is formed and executed. Within a particular nation-state, some groups are sufficiently powerful to exert a major, perhaps dominant influence over state policy and the ideological systems. Their special interests then become, in effect, the national interest. To take again the case of Guatemala in 1954, the United Fruit Company had an interest in blocking land reform. I did not. What was the national interest? In practice, it was the special interest of those with the power to influence and execute state policy and to shape the basic structure of the ideological system, including the flow of information. We can understand the power of the experiment, the state, the national interest, if we recognize these abstractions as representing higher authority, the parent of the dependency fantasy who protects, rewards, and punishes. Appreciation of the power and ubiquitous nature of the dependency fantasy helps us to understand how, at every level of government and society, people set aside any doubts by assuming that they must know what they are doing. Often, they are not to be found. Even national leaders can react like small children, ready to believe that the driver of the car must be wise. But the shepherds are not different from the sheep.